Happy day 7 of Vlogmas. You guys, we have gotten 7 days down and we've got insert someone who does math in their head, however many days left to go. But I'm really excited about today's content. Why? Because today I am giving you advice for my beginners on how to get started sewing. So if you have seen either on Threads or on Instagram or anywhere else where people are out here making their clothes and you're like, hey, I want to learn to sew too, but I don't know where to start, this video is for you. So stay tuned if this is for you. And if you are someone who already knows how to sew and you're like, I actually have a lot of friends who really want to learn how to sew, go ahead and send them this video here. And with that, let's go ahead and get into today's content. Okay, so my name is Aaronica Cole, and this is my channel, Aaronica B. Cole & Co., where the & Co. is sometimes my kids or pets or husband who occasionally join us for vlogs and things along those lines. Now, if you're like new to the channel and you're like, okay, girl, what makes you qualified to tell me what I need to do in order to get started? Aside from looking around my office, y'all can't see too much because today my office is a mess, but I have been sewing many years. I started sewing when I was about 6, 7. By hand sewing. I started machine sewing when I was 13. And then I actually became a pattern designer as well as teacher in the past couple of years. And I do know a little something about some sewing. Now, if you're anything like me, and you're just like, look, I need like as easy as possible. I'm not trying to go through a whole rigmarole about everything I need to do in order to get started. This is for you because look, as a neurodivergent baddie, we don't really have time to deal with the fluff. We're trying to get into the meat and the potatoes because we're trying to sew. So let's get into it, okay? Obviously, the first thing that you're gonna need in order to start sewing is a sewing machine. I know, that is like straight obvious. What sewing machine though, right? Now, I am someone who does not believe in breaking the bank for anything really, because let's be real here, our bank accounts be texting us daily like, girl, don't do it. We don't have it in us for another purchase. So here's what I will say about a sewing machine. Granted, I am a Burnett as well as Bernina brand ambassador. Do I recommend these machines? Absolutely. Do you need to start out with the most expensive machine? Absolutely not. One of the big things that you want to look for is the quality of the machine, not how many stitches it does. And if you're like, why you say how many stitches? Because listen, when I used to be out here shopping for sewing machines, I would be like, I want the machine that does the most amount of stitches because in my head, that meant that it was going to be the highest quality. And in reality, you don't really use all them stitches, not unless you're doing a lot of decorative stitching, and many of us simply are not. So when it comes time for looking for a machine, I do highly suggest a Burnett B05, either Academy or Crafter. Both of those machines are really fantastic machines. Burnett is basically like the little sister to Bernina. And as far as quality goes in the machines, they are a top tier quality machine. They are not expensive. You will not be breaking the bank in order to get it. And the B5s have been around enough for you to be able to get one that's refurbished for an even better price. If you're like, girl, where do I get a refurbished machine? Go to a local sewing machine dealer. Chances are they will have excellently refurbished machines that are there. And if you're like, why does that matter? It matters because our machines are very similar to like a car, right? Where your car engine is set up to do X amount of like miles, right? So let's say you get a Toyota. Listen, them Toyotas, they are never going to die, right? You're going to be able to get to like 300K miles. Very similar with mileage. We have stitches on machines. So you want a machine that is going to go the distance as far as at how many stitches it can do before one, maintenance, two, it breaks down and it goes kaput, okay? Berninas as well as Burnett's are fantastic machines. I can't say enough about them. Most of us know about Singers and Brothers. They are not bad machines. They are fantastic machines. In fact, when I really started sewing, I was using a Brother Project runway machine, and baby, that thing lasted, right? Until it broke. But I digress, okay? Start out with a machine that you can afford. That is going to be the big thing. Why? Because we don't want to have to replace that baby anytime soon, okay? So start out with a machine that you can afford. You're going to need a handful of other things in order to simply get started. You're going to need a high quality thread. Now, many of us have seen Coats and Clark, or even they are not the best threads. There was like recently a debate in like a sewing machine group, a sewing group that I'm in on Facebook about how glutamine actually tears up machines. While I'm not here to poop on different brands, what I will say is that I use Orifil as well as Metler threads in my machines simply because they are excellent threads, right? And by excellent thread, I mean that they are going to leave as little as possible of a lint in your machine. That is going to be important because you do have to clean out that lint from your machine. And so sometimes that lint can cause bigger issues if you don't clean it properly, and that is not what we want. So we want to leave as little lint as possible. So I do highly suggest doing a higher quality thread just because it's going to have longevity for your machine as well as for whatever it is that you make. So now that you've got your threads, you definitely need to get two types of, or actually three types of scissors. The first ones are going to be your fabric shears, meaning that you only use these shears, these scissors for fabric. That's it. Don't try to break them out for any kind of plastic, anything, any kind of paper, anything. No. Protect these with your life. You need fabric shears, fabric only, okay? Then you're going to need a pair of pinking shears. And the pinking shears are the ones that leave kind of like the jagged edge or whatever. These are going to be fantastic for whenever it is that you're sewing woven fabric because they prevent fraying. So you need a pair of pinking shears. You also need a pair of basic scissors. Why? Because when it comes time to needing to cut your elastic, to cut your paper, to cut your tissue, etc., that's what you're going to use it for, okay? So have those three specific things, and that is what you need. Another suggestion to have is going to be a thread snip. The thread snips are going to be perfect for snipping, obviously, threads, right? So when you're cleaning up those projects, okay? Some other things that are very useful are, of course, your Wonder Clips. Now, I don't personally like to use pins on my projects. The reason why I do not like to use pins is simply because, one, I'm likely to draw blood. Okay, your girl is accident prone. So I try to reduce the amount of sharp things around me. And then I also feel like sometimes it can leave holes in your fabrics, and that's not really what I want. So I prefer clips, but you do absolutely need both. I'm not gonna lie, because if you are putting on a pocket or something along those lines, you're gonna need those pins, okay, babe? So you're gonna need clips as well as pins. You want to do a good sharp pin. These are not expensive. If you look at my video, which I'll link to up here, that was on the holiday gift list, I listed both of these products on that list as well. So after you get your pins and your clips, you've got your thread, you've got your scissors, your shears, you've got your sewing machine. The next thing that you're going to need is a mat, a cutting mat. You're going to want a self-healing cutting mat. The reason why you want that self-healing cutting mat is because when you're pinning your projects or you're putting your projects together, you want to make sure that you're doing it on a surface that is not going to actually get damaged by using sharp objects on them, right? And I prefer the self-healing mat over like the cardboard mat that folds up and folds down, simply because, look, you can pin straight through that cardboard. You're not going to be able to pin straight through these self-healing mats, okay? So a self-healing mat, I have a mat that is 36 by 48 because that's the same width of my table. If you do not have a dedicated sewing space, that's okay. Being able to pull out a mat so that you can simply do your pinning or your cutting on that is absolutely fine. Many of us start out that exact way, okay? So a self-healing mat. Now, I don't feel like this is something that you need as a beginner, but it is something that I absolutely love having, and it is a rotary cutter. I'm a rotary cutter girl. I prefer to cut my fabrics using a rotary cutter, but it's also because I use a projector to sew, but we'll get into that another time. This is for beginners, okay? But a rotary cutter you can use on your self-healing mat, and it does aid in cutting out your patterns, or rather your fabrics from your patterns. So boom. So now that you have some of those basics in order, silly Aaronica, you need needles, okay? So a universal needle is going to be perfect to start out with, especially if you don't know exactly what the materials that you're going to be using. So using a universal needle in your sewing machine will allow you to do both knit as well as woven projects. But as you really get into doing one or the other, you're going to want to make sure that you update your needles to include things like a leather needle, a denim needle, microtex needle. And if you plan on doing sewing things like feathers, you're going to want to use like the non-stick needles, because sewing with feathers is going to gunk up that needle, okay? So needles, hands down, definitely going to need them. But honestly, that's about all the actual products that you need in order to start sewing. One of the most common questions that I get asked about Okay, so what should I try to sew first? Or how do I get into sewing? There's a couple of things that I highly recommend before jumping into sewing. The first is learning what a seam allowance is. And if you're like, okay, girl, well, what's a seam allowance is the distance from the edge of the fabric to where it is that you're putting your stitch line. Okay, so learning how to abide or keep those seam allowances is going to be a huge tool. One of the things that you can do is just simply one of the things that I had my son do when I was teaching him, or as I'm teaching him to sew, is I simply drew a line on like a pair of denim, or I'm sorry, on some denim fabric. Why denim? Simply because I had been upcycling some denim. So that's the scrap fabric that I had around. And I had him practice maintaining a seam allowance by drawing the seam allowance on there for him. That is an easy exercise that you can do using any kind of fabric that it is that you have lying around your house or that you have bought. The other thing that you need to practice, of course, is actually sewing a straight line. Now, I'm one of those people who's like, sewing a straight line is entirely overrated, and it is, right? Because you can absolutely complete these projects without sewing a perfectly straight line. But when it comes time to hem, as well as when it comes time to do straight lines, I sew a lot of apparel, so there's a lot of curves for the sewing that I do. But understanding how to hold your hands is really big, right? So that's the reason why I say practice sewing those and abiding by those seam allowances, as well as sewing those straight lines. The main reason why I say that is because it's going to help you with your muscle memory of your hand placement, okay? The other thing that you want to practice just up front is sewing curves. So it's a different skill set of sewing a straight line than it is sewing a curve, okay? So simply draw a curve, draw a circle, and practice sewing around those straight lines. Now, the other common question that I get asked is, what do I start sewing first? Whatever it is that you feel like you'll finish. Simple as that. When I started back into sewing like regularly, it was when those the LuLaRoe leggings were big, and I was like, I am not spending no $25 on no leggings. As it turns out, I spent way more, but whatever. Find a project that you're going to finish, okay? There are a plethora of patterns that I have already listed, a lot of freebies, linking right here to the freebies that I dropped over here that you can start out with, that are small projects that come with instructions as well as a picture tutorial that will help you to complete them. This is the perfect time to do it. Why? Because many of us are on Christmas break. We get some extra time off. You have some time that you can practice. So download one of those patterns and get to it. If you're like, girl, I'm trying to sew like some clothes, start out with a t-shirt. I'm not someone who thinks that you have to start out sewing with woven fabrics before you jump into knits, because I started sewing knits first. But go ahead, jump into a pattern. Read the instructions, ask some questions. And what I will also say is that if you have some specific questions or some specific requests for content, make sure that you drop a comment below, because I really create the content that is for you and answering your questions. So that is really all you need in order to get started. You don't need to buy a bunch of patterns, because there's so many free ones that are out there on the internet today. Don't go out and spend a whole lot of money. There are secondhand fabric stores, secondhand craft stores that you can start out by buying your fabrics instead of like spending a whole lot of money going to like a bigger store that might have things that are priced a little bit higher. Seek out secondhand stores. You can go to thrift stores and buy sheets in order to start out. It will not break the bank, and it'll also teach you how to create some bedsheet couture. That concludes the content for day 7 of Vlogmas. Again, if you do have specific questions, definitely drop them below, because I will be back to answer those questions, and you might even get a whole video out of it. Until next time, stay merry and stay brave.